Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. I got to speak at NYU yesterday, which I never thought was going to happen. The art, text, and media concentration of the Liberal Studies School brought me in to talk about comics, cartoonists, cartooning, and podcasting in advance of the New York Comic-Con. It was pretty neat. Like 15 to 20 students, basically freshmen and sophomores, plus a couple of professors there. And I had a page of notes, no visuals, but I had a lot of fun. I talked about comics, what they are, what they do, how they work, how you discover them, and what it's like going to a convention, festival, etc. And took a lot of questions from the students. I won't say kids because that's mean. It was a good time. I learned a bit just in terms of how to frame comics in a way that people who are new to them are going to get. So it was kind of an honor. So I want to thank Deja, who invited me there, and all the students and professors who came out. I did get a little motivational speakery at one point when they were just asking about getting started with the podcast, making it, etc. And I sort of went into the do the work thing, which, just involves the don't wait for the right time. Don't wait until you've bought the right equipment or got X, Y, and Z in place. Just start making it, whatever it is, whether it's a podcast, comic, story, whatever. Go forward with that, figure out everything afterwards, but, don't wait on the perfect moment. Anyway, that was kind of neat. It was stuff that I wish someone had said to me back then. I probably wouldn't have listened, but at least I could reflect back on that and kick myself even more for not listening when it was offered. All of which brings me to our second episode of the week, which has nothing to do with those sorts of regrets. My guest this time around is Witold Rybczynski, the renowned writer on architecture. Back in March of 2015, Witold was part of the greatest month of podcasts I ever did. That was the sequence that included Walter Kern and Thea Bell, Prue Shaw, and the great Clive James. And at the end of that 5-week run, I seriously considered retiring the show. I kind of figured it was never going to get any better than this. Of course, I've gone on to reach those heights again and again because my life is filled with wonders and joy. Anyway, that time, Witold and I got together in his suburban Philadelphia home to talk about his book, How Architecture Works, and the practice of architecture in general and his history. This time around, I visited him at his new place in Center City, Philadelphia, to talk about his new book, Charleston Fancy, Little Houses and Big Dreams in the Holy City, which came out last spring from Yale University Press. Charleston Fancy is this really charming book about Charleston's historic district and this group of people who build quirky homes there with these sorts of amazing flourishes, like Byzantine domes, and one builds this little Palladian villa. And they're not just building for themselves. They develop, these blocks and other areas to bring in more people. And Witold, he explores their stories over the span of decades, actually, and what brought them to Charleston and the people whose lives they touch and how the city evolved over time to sort of accommodate their unique visions. And he also goes into Charleston's history, which is very, very particular, I'd say unique, and its ups and downs over the centuries, and how the peninsula there has a sort of unique and weird democratizing element to home building. The characters that he writes about, and they're real people. This is nonfiction, but the characters have such oddball features. They'd be at home in a novel. They're compelling in the fact that they have visions for these homes and neighborhoods. And we also learn about the struggles and successes they have in developing them. So I really enjoyed the hell out of Charleston Fancy. It now has me putting Charleston on my to visit list. I was there once a million years ago for a business meeting, but didn't know. Well, it was early on in my business life, and I had no idea what I was there for, and no idea how to really look around and see a city. So like I said, Charleston Fancy came out late spring, and it was on my radar, but I got kind of busy and weird this summer and didn't get a chance to follow up. So Witold dropped me a line late in the summer to remind me about it, and I thought, I've got business in Philly. Let's get together and record. So not a lot of caveats this time, just acoustics in the apartment. It's a high ceiling, so sound is a little bit weird, and I tried to correct for that, but really there's no major stuff this time around. Now here's Witold's bio from his website. Witold Rybczynski was born in Edinburgh of Polish parentage, raised in London, and attended Jesuit schools in England and Canada. He studied architecture at McGill University in Montreal, where he also taught for 20 years. He is Emeritus Professor of Urbanism at the University of Pennsylvania. He has designed and built houses as a registered architect, as well as doing practical experiments in low-cost housing, which took him to Mexico, Nigeria, India, the Philippines, and China. He has written for The Atlantic, The New Yorker, New York Review of Books, and The New York Times, and has been architecture critic for Saturday Night, Wigwag, and Slate. From 2004 to 2012, he served on the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts. He lives with his wife Shirley Hallam in a loft in an old industrial building near the Schuylkill River in downtown Philadelphia. He doesn't think of himself as someone with hobbies. He used to garden under pressure. He doesn't collect anything, but he has a lot of books, albeit fewer since downsizing. His new book is Charleston Fancy from Yale University Press. And now, the 2019 Virtual Memories conversation with Witold Rybczynski. Tell me about the origins for Charleston Fancy. Where'd the book come from, and what was your history with the city?
Well, it's a story about a group of people that I've known for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
The first one I probably met about more than 20 years ago. And at one point, I did actually think about writing a book, that there was interesting. They were builders and developers in Charleston, South Carolina, and I just couldn't figure out how to get into the book. I'd written a book about real estate called Last Harvest, which was a sort of real life book where I'd followed a project over several years mm-hmm. in real time. Whereas this was more like a history, and it was looking back at what they had done in the 80s. And so I wasn't really quite sure how to do it. And so I set it aside, and about 2 or 3 years ago, I got an email from one of my friends there who said, George, who's one of the leading characters in this story, that is, he had built this amazing Byzantine house with domes and columns and arcades, and they said his house had burned down. And first of all, I thought, what a sad thing, but then I realized this could be the beginning of a story. I mean, it's like a dramatic event, and so I thought maybe I'll see, and I started writing, and it just followed naturally from there. So it's not how I usually write, but in this case, the book sort of appeared. And once I'd written sort of the first page, I realized I can just keep going. And I wrote, the first chapter and then the second chapter, and it sort of proceeded from there.
And did it evolve like that for you because of the character and the characters of the people, or the architecture and how it contrasted with what was going on within?
Well, it was. I realized much later. I didn't think of this at the time, but the book has three themes. It's about architecture, and because their architecture was really interesting, and it was very traditional, but in a very offbeat sort of way. And secondly, it's about real estate development, because there were bigger and smaller projects which were essentially real estate developments that they were doing. They were building houses and then renting them out or selling them. And I'd written a book about real estate, so I was interested in that subject. And it's also a book about a city, because Charleston is such an interesting, unusual, historic place. And so it was about the interplay of these three things. And that was really, I didn't think of it that clearly at the time, but that's how the book came together. And then it was a story it was really two stories, because it was about things that had happened starting roughly in the 1980s. And then it was about what was going on today. So it was both talking to people and about what they had done in the past, and also just writing about what was going on, what they were doing today. So the book kind of brings those two time periods together.
Did you have trepidation in terms of, without giving anything away, parts of the book are about the rise and fall of developers' fortunes and how certain planned areas fall apart because of financing and economic conditions. Any fears or concerns when you made the cutoff point, basically, for the book, when you finished it, that it was just, let's hope nothing falls through. Mm-hmm. Everything's
well, the problem with the book was not so much, because the book ends up with a real estate project that one of the characters in the book is doing, and that's still not finished, but it's finished enough that I was able to kind of close that off. And plus his own house, which was part of this project, was finished, and he had moved into it. So that was all. The actual problem was George's house, because George's house had burnt down, and that's how the book starts. And it seemed to me you have to finish with him rebuilding it. That kind of closes the circle. And he never could get around to it. He kept putting it off. He kept getting involved in other things. And he had built the house about 20 years ago, almost. So, the energy that it requires to build a house, somehow he was having trouble finding it. So in the end, he was able to describe what he planned to do, which I thought was good enough. He still hasn't built it. So if I'd waited, it would be now more than a year and a half since the book was finished, and it's still not built. So I'm not 100% sure if he'll do it at one point, because it was a labor of love. It's a Byzantine house, as I said. It has these arcades and domes and columns. And it's a very small house. It's not a
pool inside.
And a swimming pool inside. And it was one of those things where you can't recreate it. And I think rebuilding it feels like you're trying to reconstruct your life when you were a young person, and that felt wrong. And also, as I wrote in the book, he'd been living in a tiny apartment after his house burned down that belonged to a friend of his. And he kind of got used to living in a tiny apartment. And he realized he didn't really want all this space that he had in the house, which was not large, but it was certainly not tiny. And so that was, I think, another problem, that he didn't see the point of recreating. On the other hand, the house wasn't a total loss. There were, the roof had burnt off, but their walls were there, and it wasn't sort of, you couldn't just start a completely new house. The swimming pool was still there. So I really don't know what he's going to do.
There's something to
He
be
may
said for
never
ruins.
rebuild it. It's a beautiful ruin. That's
Yeah.
the other problem. I was just there a few weeks ago, and I wouldn't say it's better than it was, but it's very poetic. The
Byzantine
architecture.
nature of it makes it, at least from all of your
Yeah.
descriptions, it sounds like it would be just as gorgeous, as
Yes,
as
and I was there doing an interview for a newspaper with a photographer, and I mean it was so. I realized that this is so photogenic because it looked old, but burnt out. It looks kind of ancient. It looks like an ancient ruin that's been there for hundreds of years, and it has no roof, and there's light. The sunlight's coming into the room, so it was very picturesque and very beautiful.
From the Turkish settlers of South Carolina, from the middle of the last millennium. Or something.
I should say that there was one Byzantine building that I came across that still exists in Charleston. There was
It predates
predates this. This is from the early 1900s, and it was originally a bank, and is I think now a restaurant. But it has Saracenic arches and the sort of Moorish details. It's quite amazing to see it.
You talk about what brought you down to Charleston initially, and then again what brought you back repeatedly over the years. I know you sort of go into the story of the book, but
initially Shirley and I we had a spring break, and we thought we would go somewhere warm for a week or two. Well, a week really, and we had read about Buford. I shouldn't say we had read about it. We saw this movie that I always forget the title of, with Kevin Kline and William Hurt, that was filmed in Buford. It's Buford was a colonial town where the planters from South Carolina in the summers would go to the shore because it was slightly cooler than inland, and they built these beautiful houses, which have survived all this time. And so that seemed like a sort of destination. We wanted to see it, and I went down there. And while we're there, we met Vince, who's one of the characters in the story, who was developing a little project just outside Buford, but trying to kind of recreate some of the character of the colonial town, which had these beautiful houses and kind of big treed streets, and it was very attractive. And so that was our first visit. And then through Vince, who later moved to Charleston, I kind of had been in Charleston several times and seen him and followed him. And he introduced me to George, who was then building a house for his sister. He was a builder, George. He wasn't an architect, but he designed the buildings that he built as a contractor. And he built a house for his sister, which was a Palladian house. And it's in the middle of this old suburban subdivision out in north of Charleston, is this Palladian villa. I mean, very small, a little kind of bungalow, but which has a pedimented columned front, and it was really quite beautiful. So that was how I met George, and then over the years I kept in touch with him, and I introduced one of my students to him, and they ended up being partners and working together in Charleston on various design projects. So there was a long kind of history that before I actually wrote the book. So the book was more something that came at the end of all of this.
Yeah. It's interesting to me because you could say the genesis of it is just this little tiny block in Charleston where these people built these amazing homes and kind of rejuvenated this tiny area, which sort of makes me wonder how many more of those stories are out there, how many other just little unique slices within cities like that, within cities that aren't being profiled in magazines and books, whether that's just cropping up in little places or how unique and special this area really is.
I think it's unique in the sense that Charleston is unique, because Charleston was one of the richest colonial cities. It was not as big as Philadelphia and New York, but it was probably richer mainly because of the cotton trade and the slave trade. And so it built, for a small city, it built sort of amazing architecture because people had a lot of money and they put it into their homes. And so you have all these pre-independence buildings, and even after independence that continued. So Charleston is unusual. Savannah is about the closest parallel in Georgia, but it's a different sort of situation than, say, New Orleans or some of the other southern cities. But I think you're right. There are probably, in many cities, little builders. Even in a city like, say, Philadelphia, often what starts off development in a old part of a city is the small builders. The big developers come later, and then they see opportunities, and then they buy larger things. But the first thing is usually, as I describe it, a small group, they buy a house. Often they live in it because they don't have much money. They fix it up, they rent it out or sell it. They buy a second house, and I think that is a common occurrence in many, especially older cities and older parts of old cities.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned in the book that Charleston was the first city in the country to actually have, was it zoning laws or zoning committee?
Historic zoning laws. Yeah. Zoning actually it comes around, I forget, in the 20s. The Supreme Court says you can zone, because there was a big question whether that was even constitutional to tell people what to do.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court said, yes, your zoning is permitted, and Charleston was the first city to use zoning to protect historical areas, because it was a poor city, and it was not a booming place. But the unusual thing about Charleston is that the old Charleston families all stayed in Charleston, and Charleston is built on a peninsula, so it can't really grow in all directions, and so throughout its history, the center of Charleston has remained pretty stable compared to most American cities. And because of this attachment that the old families had to Charleston, there was this kind of continuity. So they were not a wealthy city, but they wanted to preserve the historical areas. And what was happening was that, for instance, in the 20s, gas stations started to be built in cities because people were having cars, and you had to have a gas station to get gas. And so they were buying old buildings, tearing them down, and building a gas station. Also in Charleston, antique dealers were buying buildings and then stripping out the beautiful decor, shipping it north to their shops and selling it, and demolishing the house. And so these old families got together and started buying up these old houses, and then they realized that you couldn't. It wasn't enough just to save a house here and there. You really needed to save a street of houses if you wanted to save the atmosphere of the city. And so they came up with this idea of zoning. Initially, it was a little piece at the end of the peninsula, which was the oldest part of the city, and they zoned it so that you couldn't demolish without going through a process. They made it's called a Board of Architectural Review, which the city appointed sort of architects and real estate people and engineers, and a number of people. There were 5 or 6 people, and whether you were demolishing a building or just adding on to a building or just modifying a building, you had to get their approval. And this was not advisory. This was a real board.
Yay or nay.
They could say yes or no. And so, because Charleston wasn't booming or nothing was really happening, they were able to not only save the old parts of the city, but this zoning district got bigger and bigger. So every few years they would enlarge it and take in more of the city. So by the 1970s and 80s, it was almost the whole peninsula was covered by this historic zoning. And when you go to Charleston, for instance, there is no high-rise business district. The highest buildings are 10 stories, and they're very scattered. There's a few apartment buildings mainly of about that height. But it's basically a low city. It doesn't have the taller office buildings that are almost ubiquitous in the United States. Most cities have somewhere they may be very tall or just 10 or 20 stories. And Charleston doesn't have that. And also their downtown stayed the same. Because of this sort of family tradition connection to the city, the downtown stayed where it was, and the fancier part of town stayed where it was. And so instead of moving away and living somewhere in the suburbs, the city stayed more or less where it was. So by the time people really got interested in history, and there's a lot of tourism that then develops just around these old cities like New Orleans and Savannah and Charleston. They had this wonderful bunch of old buildings that they had preserved all this time. So it turned out suddenly there aren't that many American cities where you go and it actually looks the way it did, in this case, in colonial times.
Sure.
And, Boston and Philadelphia all have, like 2 blocks or 3 blocks. Here you have streets of these old buildings. So then you got the development of the tourist industry and people buying old houses and living there in the wintertime particularly. So but until the 40s and 50s, Charleston was a very sort of backwater, and then it starts to boom in terms of real estate and tourism, and then eventually jobs, because it then turns out you have this funny situation where a lot of younger people are working for startups, technology startups, which basically can be anywhere, right? All they need is a Wi-Fi connection.
Yeah.
And they like to be in old places, in places with where you can walk around, where there are good restaurants, and where there's a kind of nice atmosphere. And so Charleston actually attracted a lot of that. And so while it also attracted tourists, it also became a place where people are actually working and living. It also has a big university population, so a large student population. So in terms of my story, all of this, of course, helped them, because in the 80s when they started, it was all kind of iffy, and they were buying these empty houses in pretty abandoned neighborhoods. But because of this real estate boom and the tourism and then the students and the employment, that all, of course, helped them. So if you go today to that area, this is like maybe 20 years later, it looks very nice. There are boutiques and coffee shops and little restaurants around there. So that, of course, helped them because then they were people who wanted to rent from them and so on.
And even selling the homes means you can finance the
Yes.
next batch. And is it sort of a unique case where preservation worked well in a city? I guess the question is how often does preservation start to go awry versus really serving its goal like it sounds like it did here?
Well, I think with Charleston, it's more like a question mark, because right now there's an awful lot of pressure in Charleston because the real estate has become valuable. Mm-hmm. Large real estate developers are attracted to do projects, but of course they do big projects. They don't do little projects. And I guess it's a question of how Charleston is going to deal with this, to what extent it will change Charleston. Because Charleston was in a way lucky. In the 50s and post-war period, 50s and 60s, most American cities were rebuilt. We tore down whole neighborhoods. We called it urban renewal, but it was really demolition, and we built new. That didn't happen in Charleston. There's like one or two, really one urban renewal project. Basically, it was just the economy was too sluggish, the people weren't interested, and so it didn't happen. What's happening now is this real estate boom, which it does threaten the city. So it's more of a question mark of how they will deal with it. Most cities didn't deal with it easily because, for instance, Boston has a lot of historic areas, but there the real estate boom happened much earlier. So there's parts of Boston which kind of get preserved, but changed drastically, and the high real estate values sort of altered the city irrevocably, and the best they could do was save the buildings, but they couldn't really save the neighborhoods in any real sense. So it's Boston, of course, a big city. I think one of the advantages Charleston had was very small. So by the 60s, their historic zoning basically covered the entire city. It wasn't just a piece of the city. So in the last decades, most of the development has taken place outside the peninsula, in the suburbs of Charleston, some of which belongs to the city. So the city was very aggressive in expanding and appropriating. Yeah,
it sounded the way you break it out here. It kept taking over more suburbs.
And that was like a safety valve. So they were able to get real estate development, new development happening outside the historic areas, and that enabled them to preserve the historic areas. I think that's changing now because there's this, if you go to Charleston now, there's literally dozens of hotels being built, and there's dozens of real estate residential projects, which is partly retirement and partly people moving to Charleston to work. So that is changing the city, and the scale of those projects tends to be very big compared to what I describe in the book, which are sort of a dozen houses, whereas these are block-sized developments.
And the Texas donut, which I had never heard before until I read the book.
Well, that's this, where you take a full block and you put parking in the middle, and then you surround it with apartments or offices or some combination. Cars, of course, change everything, and accommodating cars requires parking garages.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the bar, that committee, part of the mandate is to include, was it 2 parking spots per?
Yes,
per residence?
That was when I describe these projects, one of the big challenges is parking, because yes, you have to provide 2 spots for every unit, and they the people I described became very good at sort of fitting in the cars. It's a little bit like when you go to Europe. The cities are not full of parking lots the way our cities are. Yeah. But the cars are everywhere because people sort of fit them into back lanes and little cul-de-sacs and just on the sidewalk next to the street. And so they are able to do that. And I must say the city was also very flexible in accommodating that.
It didn't have to be
and
uniform.
That was unusual too. Most cities, I think, might resist the sort of developments that these people were doing because they were unconventional. Whereas I think the mayor of Charleston, Joe Riley, was very progressive in that sense. He understood that to save the city, you couldn't just apply conventional thinking. You had to accept unusual things. And his administration did. And so I think that was part of the success as well.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the notion of locatecture that you sort of champion in the book and how it plays out in the city?
Yes, I mean, that was, it's a kind of silly word, but I just threw it in there. Yeah. It really has to do with the idea that if people are local, they do understand the city better, and they are able to respond in a way that is more difficult for outsiders. And what's happening, for instance, today with large developments, the developers are national, sometimes international companies, and they tend to work with, of course, architects from wherever. But the result is that you get the sort of subtleties that a local person might be responsive to get lost in the process. And pretty soon, and you can see this in Charleston today, you have developments that could be anywhere. They could be in Atlanta or San Jose, or I mean, they're not. There's nothing there that says this is really Charleston. And so the truth is not only one of the kind of main actors in my story is from Charleston. He's like a third generation Charlestonian. Most of them are from other places, and they've been attracted to Charleston and have lived there a long time. But they have an attachment to the place that is realer than somebody coming in from outside and trying to sort of gets often a kind of superficial idea of what Charleston is about. And the Board of Architecture Review, of course, is set up to try to circumvent that, to make sure that local things are borne in mind. But it's hard when you have these very large projects. I mean, large developers tend to have a template. I mean, things that they know will work. And then they just apply it.
The things that will scale based on,
the
manufacturing partnerships they have,
and they work with bankers who understand that, and so the idea that they would develop a different project for one city, and Charleston is an unusual city. Partly because it was on a peninsula, which meant it couldn't really grow in all directions. It's a relatively dense city which has these unusual types of housing that really is not present in other southern cities. And it has this continuity, which is very unusual too in American cities, that what they did in the colonial period, they basically just kept doing it. So the house type that developed, they call it a single house because it's one room wide. And it's very deep, but it's not a row house. There's no row housing in Charleston, unlike Philadelphia. This develops in the colonial period, and then it just continues. So they still build single houses. They're not necessarily colonial looking. They don't put columns and pediments on them, but they're basically, that's what they are. And so that's a very unusual thing. Most cities, like Philadelphia, there's a colonial period when people built individual houses, and then in the industrial era, you get these row houses and sort of worker housing going in, and you can sort of follow along. And Charleston is unusual because it has a much more greater consistency than most cities. And of course, for a big developer who's based in Texas or somewhere, and he comes in, he's not going to develop a special solution for Charleston. So he has a formula that works, that's successful, that he understands and his bankers understand, and that's what gets done. So I'm not terribly optimistic in the short run for Charleston. I think they're going to build a lot of stuff that is not particularly suitable for Charleston. On the other hand, as I pointed out in the book, eventually the boom will stop. I mean, all booms stop. And then they'll be kind of thrown back on their own resources, and they'll end up doing smaller stuff. And I would hope or expect that they'll kind of go back to what they know and what people like, and hopefully that will create a greater sense of continuity.
Did you ever just design for fun a Charleston single house? Did you ever think of, as you were working with these guys and just learning their stories, did you ever think, what I would do?
Not really, no. Okay. But I did I became aware of sort of what a rich type it is, because it was, as I said, it was a narrow house. The single refers to that they were a single room wide. So the houses are anywhere from 12 feet to maybe 20 feet. It's also a very unusual house, a kind of a very democratic house, because you can build a single house which is almost a mansion that's very wide, that has very wide verandas. There was always a veranda on one side. Or you can build one that's 12 feet very narrow without any verandas, and if you're a blue-collar worker. And so the same type tended to be used by all different classes of people, which is also kind of unusual because most housing, if you look at Philadelphia, the row houses are always narrow and small, and there are some larger row houses, but the really rich people move out and build mansions in the country, and they're quite different. And so there's a kind of flexibility built into it that's admirable. So even though we now have air conditioning and we don't really need one-room wide houses, the type continues, and partly also because, in terms of cities, the way a city is cut up is the hardest thing to change. So, when you have fires in cities or floods or
the calamities
of some sort, the one thing that you can't change afterwards is property ownership, because that's all part of the law and you have different owners. So you always end up going back to what you had, even if you didn't want to, because the lots are there. And so, if a neighborhood burns down in Philadelphia, which hasn't happened, thankfully, for ages, but if it did, you'd still have to build townhouses, because that's how it's all divided up into 18-foot wide lots. There's nothing else you can build. In Charleston, of course, the lots are a little bit wider, and people have been building these separated, narrow houses for so long, because also that's what fits in. And they've figured out ways. Sometimes you put a shop in the ground floor, or you have rooms off the veranda, so you turn it into a sort of rooming house, or you make a really big one, and it becomes like a mansion. So they've figured out how to manipulate it.
And there are sections that sound like a game of Tetris when when the builders finally have a significant number of lots together, and they're just trying to figure out a configuration of how many units, not to maximize units, but how do we do this in an interesting way that's going to satisfy the people we know who want to buy the homes and give it some degree of character.
Well, no, maximize, not a bad word, because the
density is insane compared to what I'm used to.
They're all businessmen. They've understood that if you do something beautiful and either nobody wants it, or they can't afford it, or you can't afford it, and you go bankrupt, then it's like game over.
Yeah.
So what they figured out was that one of the formulas that George and his friends figured out in development was that they could make smaller houses and put more of them on a lot, but they could increase the quality of the house and make them special, make them unusual rather than generic. And that there were people who were willing to pay the trade-off. They understood they weren't getting the square footage because it was a smaller house, but they were getting something nicer. And they found at least enough people that they were able to succeed at that way. And so as you said, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. They're trying to cram the units in, but at the same time, they're putting enormous thought into designing the house. And so, with little alcoves and sitting places, and, the bathroom has, wonderful tile work. And so the kind of details that you just don't find in a developer type of house. That's what they were doing. And at the beginning, they were also doing a lot of recycling. So they would find old broken up tiles somewhere and use those and make interesting floors out of them, which was cheap, and it was also unusual and actually very attractive. So it was this sort of interesting formula, which was, on the one hand, very realistic and down to earth, but quite idealistic when it came to the architecture and creating density, which, we know from many studies that just density alone is actually generally a plus. It creates more people. More people means there's more activity, there's more people to support businesses and so on. And so these projects they do are often extremely dense. One of the things they tried to always include in the buildings, particularly ones they were selling, was the ability to sort of turn a room into a rental unit. So that, because there was this market of students and young people, waiters, and who were looking for a small apartment that they could live in. And so if you could just lock a door and turn an extra room into a rental unit, it had a little bathroom, maybe a kitchenette, that would, help to pay the mortgage on your house. And so a lot of their units are designed that way so that you could do that. You didn't have to do it, and it could just be a guest room. But you had the ability to rent. And the city tends to be pretty flexible, so that I forget what the exact rule is, but it's something like you're allowed to have one rental room per unit or something like that. So this was also, I think, part of their success, is that their houses take that into account.
Without giving anything away, it doesn't work out well for George, but that's a separate situation that comes up when we find out more about the fire. A question I had in the book, though, you mentioned Andrew Gould, the UPenn student who you refer and ends up moving down there. Never saw a set of construction drawings while he was studying architecture as a graduate student at UPenn. Is that weird? Is that something you think architecture students should do?
I don't think it is unusual, because
the idea is he gets down there and we need you to draw up a building, and he has never actually seen. And
Andrew's very bright, and he, an old architect helps him, and he very quickly catches up. And in fact, he's become a kind of super expert, because he's a very creative person, but he's also the kind of person that reads every single regulation and knows them better than the regulators. And so he's able to sort of navigate through building regulations and codes and so on. But it isn't, unfortunately, it's not unusual. I think it's partly the result in education of spending a lot of time on computer technology. The thing about computers is they're very useful. They're certainly useful to the architect in practice, but they do take a lot of time to learn. And they also take a lot of time to just manipulate. Once you've entered all the data, you can look at alternatives very quickly. But it does take time to enter the data. So if in terms of an education, the time that you spend doing that is the time that you don't have to spend doing other things. And so it's a question of time versus interest. And when I was a student years ago, you did have to make a set of working drawings for a project. That was an assignment. But on the other hand, the course was 6 years instead of 3, and we didn't have computers, so we didn't have to spend time learning all of that. And so we spent time, doing working drawings, which are also, it takes a lot of time. It's laborious. And we only did it once. We certainly didn't do it for every project we did, but at least we had that experience of once doing drawings where you had to show the windows and the doors and all these little details. And so at least you become familiar with it. The other aspect was also not increasingly common, is that Andrew never actually had the opportunity to work in an architect's office.
Right.
And that's not unusual. It's partly because there's an awful lot of architecture students, and partly, I know when I was my first job in an architect's office, I was really hired as a kind of public service because I wasn't able to contribute anything. I didn't know how to draw. I didn't know anything. And it was architects in those days, I think, had the sense that we should hire a young person and let him expose him to what we do. And the first year he's not going to contribute much, but he'll learn, and maybe he'll trace a drawing or do something like that. And that doesn't happen anymore. I think it's become much more, people hire students because they have to produce something. Maybe they know how to use a computer and they're useful in that way. But it means that students are not exposed to just how architects work, what they do, and how these drawings are made. One of the first jobs you have as a student, you don't know how to draw yet properly, is to correct drawings. In those days, of course, drawings were drawn in ink or pencil. So correcting a drawing means erasing a large part of the drawing and then redrawing it with whatever the correction is. So it's kind of dumb work, but that's what exposes you to how what is a construction drawing and how does it work. And so, and that opportunity is sort of gone today. So it wasn't unusual. It was kind of shocking, but not unusual that he was not exposed to construction.
Yeah. Now, let me ask, I recorded with Milton Glaser a few weeks ago, the great designer. Doesn't use computers himself. His staff uses them. He directs, and they work as his hands. Contends that in his world, computers are good at getting you to do the things that computers are good at. And I wonder, within architecture, is it also a degree of they're really good, but there's also limitations, and they kind of funnel you into something like that, as opposed to maybe something you could draw better or more innovatively in terms of how you would design a space. Do computers limit you, I guess, in that respect, even while they're creating all this freedom?
I'm not sure if they limit you, but they certainly direct you in a certain direction.
Yeah, I think that's what I mean here.
And that's true in architecture. I think computers have, in a way, created a certain kind of architecture that you wouldn't necessarily have done before computers, but which computers have enabled architects to do, particularly, for instance, indeterminate shapes. In a project, there is a point where you're doing drawings for the builder, which means that you have to know the dimension of everything. Mm-hmm. If you have a line like this, you have to be able to define it so that the builder can actually build it. So if you're working with, for instance, 45 degrees or 30 degrees, you can calculate things. If you're working with a curve that has no particular geometry, it becomes very difficult. And consequently, you tend not to use those curves because the builder can't build them. Counterintuitive. So you tend to work with 45 degrees or angles that, you can go to a table and figure out the different dimensions. With a computer, that has become less crucial. You can use very loose shapes because your computer can talk to the computer at the manufacturer or the fabricator level, or at the contractor's computer. And so in a sense, you short circuit the whole thing. So that has certainly influenced architecture. Is it for the better? I'm probably the same age as Glaser, so I would say no.
Milton's 90, please.
Oh, well, not quite. But I don't see it as better because, and I'll tell you what, the reason is that architecture for several thousand years was based on drawings. And initially the drawings were not even on paper because they didn't have paper, but they were scratched on rocks or on the ground. And then sort of sometime around the Renaissance, we started drawing on paper and communicating ideas about architecture with drawings. And since the Renaissance until the 20th century, that was the case. That was the way it was done. So if you change that, that's fine. You've changed it. But can you change, 500 years of tradition just overnight? So it's like saying, I'm going to invent a new English language. It's going to be more efficient and easier to learn, and spelling will be better. I mean, people have tried that. A, it's not so easy, and B, I think one reason it never worked is you lose touch with the past. I mean, you can't read Shakespeare anymore because you would lose that language. And that's the problem with the computer, is that the way of creating architecture and communicating it and thinking about it, which developed very slowly over this long period, you're suddenly cutting yourself off from that because you can't draw, for one thing. I wrote this book about Palladio years ago, and I was in London. They have one of the biggest collections of his drawings, and I was looking at his sketches, and they were completely legible to me because they looked like the sketches that I might make, even though they're made, in 1500, and they're made in ink because they didn't have pencil yet. They're little sketches of plans with dimensions and details, and it's exactly the way. And so you can look at it and figure out what he's doing and what he's thinking. And that, if you lose that, you lose something really precious. It's like if you were a writer and you suddenly couldn't read anything written before the year, 2019. I don't know if you could be a writer. Or if you were, what kind of writer would you be if you couldn't read Hemingway or Jane Austen or Shakespeare? I mean, you'd be a kind of strange kind of writer. And I'm afraid that's what I see happening in architecture. It's that losing that connection creates, it's not uninteresting architecture, but it's kind of disconnected. And I don't know really where it's going to go.
Has it accelerated? We recorded in 2015, so it's been about 4.5 years. Have you seen trends changing just in that span, or is it really? I wouldn't
say. No, I don't think so. But I think certainly in terms of education, drawing has become less and less significant to people.
Your concern at the time was that architecture could become more like product design, where things are only meant for a short period of time.
I think that's even
still the case.
That is more so the case than it was. And it's driven partly by the consumer, because people get so much more information over the internet that kind of a striking image is what they get of a building, and so whether it's a building or an iPhone, it starts to blur at one point, and that image becomes more powerful than anything else. And yes, I think it does become more like a product.
Well, not to get personal, but when we recorded last, you were living outside the city proper. Now we're in the middle of Philadelphia. How's your perspective changed on this, or how has it changed your understanding of the city, I guess, living in the middle of it like this?
I think one of the things is, because Philadelphia is an old city, so it has a lot of old buildings, you realize there's this real cutoff, and it's right around the Depression, sort of between 1930 and the early 30s. Almost everything built after is pretty crappy. Yeah. And everything built until then is interesting. It's not always great architecture, but if it's a townhouse, it might have some nice detail around the door or something nice about it. And it might be, if it's a big, important building, it might have all sorts of things. But after 1930, you get this real break where, when we look out the window here and you see the different buildings, it's striking how older buildings offer you something to look at and the newer buildings don't. They're either too standardized or there's a lot of high-rise buildings that you can see here, and until 1930, a high-rise building was a tower, so it had to sort of build up to a top, and it had to create some sense of movement as it went up, and then at one point it became just a box, and then especially when and in the last 10, 15, 20 years, it's a glass box. And with the glass box, you lose everything because there are no more shadows. You can't cast shadows on glass. And so, Corbusier said this famous thing about architecture is a marvelous play of masses in light. But if the masses are all glass, and he never made glass buildings, but if the masses are glass, you don't get any play of volumes in light because it looks all flat. Yeah. And that's what happens with our new buildings, which tend to be almost completely glass. They lose like 50% of what makes architecture because you don't see shadows anymore. You don't see the shadows, the play of shadows, which has been sort of traditionally is one of the powerful tools of an architect, is to create that darkness and lightness.
Although you do get that death ray building. I think it's in London, the one that happens to reflect the sunlight down on one particular point.
And to be fair, at night is when a glass building shines, yeah. And it is more exciting. But in the daytime, it's just waiting for the night to fall because there's not much going on.
And do you see more of that? Did you appreciate that or depreciate that more as you moved into Philadelphia and got to walk around?
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's natural that the important thing in a suburb tends to be the trees and the greenery, whereas in a city, the buildings do come more to the forefront. And so I think you do become aware. And I mean, the nice thing about Philadelphia is it has so many beautiful old buildings. So when you walk down a street, you've got these incredible they're mostly row houses in our neighborhood, but there's just some incredible buildings that have been built over the years with sort of Art Deco buildings and or older buildings, different materials. So there's a lot going on there. Yeah,
I had a friend who lived in one of those the row houses in the alleys, in Center City. That wonderful, really neat spot, great home, until we had to move him once, and then it was the idea of trying to get a moving truck into a alleyway that was maybe about 4.5 feet wide, and it was like, I guess we're carrying everything out to the corner and loading there. So there are aspects sometimes where a city evolves.
Or getting it in sometimes.
Yeah, I don't know how they pulled that one off. I wasn't around for the entering the city, but when we had to get them out, that was the real toughie. I know it's an unfair question, but building that you would wipe from the face of the earth, is there anything that you just consider a building that just shouldn't exist along?
Oh.
Not in a terroristic way or anything like that, but just if this building happened to be replaced by something, I'd be a lot happier.
Well, I mean, if I look...
I didn't want to mention the one right outside the window.
We're dominated by the Comcast building, the new one, not the first one. And I must say, the more I look at it, the less I like it. And it's sort of clunky, and this is the tallest building in the city, so it's taking a major position in the city.
And your window. I've noticed it from the street, and I've never seen it at this angle before.
This is the best angle, in fact.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's a funny building with this...
It's got that sort of V shape?
No, it's a very deep building, like a big box, and then it has this very tall... So looking at it end on, it's actually the most attractive view, because it sort of goes up.
Yeah.
But...
and you got the little lightning bolt or tree.
That thing going on.
I'll take a picture of it for the webpage, of course. But yeah, okay. So that would be one that you could probably do without.
Especially when there's this very attractive, not ancient building from probably the 70s or 80s. I think it's Bell Atlantic. Do you know that building that sort of steps like a Dutch house?
Yeah.
It's not glass. It's sort of, I don't know what it is, dark red concrete, stone, I'm not sure from this distance. But it's much more attractive, modern building. It's not an old-fashioned building, but it has, it's kind of dwarfed now by this other building.
Speaking of, have you visited or had made any comment on Hudson Yards up in New York City?
I've only seen pictures of it.
Okay.
It looks awful in pictures.
Oh, good. Okay. It's pretty horrifying. I've had a trade show at the Javits Center, so I've walked near it and just had what were they? Well, it's sort of the line you have about modernism in the book, the lack of empathy about buildings. That these things are just dropped by aliens into the middle of this area.
And they're all glass. I think every building there is an all glass building, and there's, in a sense, by going towards glass, you take away all the tools of the architect, so that even if they wanted to relate to each other, since they're all glass, there's not much going on. Traditionally you could change the color of the stone, or you could do things, whereas once you're all glass, there's a limited number of options.
It's like it's more just playing with geometry as opposed to...
Right,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And then you get that fakakta stairway to nowhere,
yeah.
Which at certain angles, if you just walk on the perimeter of this whole place, it just looks like a little tiny toy next to these enormous buildings. So I'm sure up close it's impressive, but when you see things at a little different perspective.
But on the other hand, if you think of Rockefeller Center, which everybody brings up because they're so similar in scale, Rockefeller Center has this enormous RCA building, and then it has this little sculpture at the bottom. But you never feel the sculpture is sort of overawed by the building. Or the sculpture, at the entrance to the RCA building, there's this guy holding lightning bolts and stuff. But you never feel that that's kind of a gratuitous add-on. So somehow I've always felt that generation of architects understood how to build these very large projects, urban projects, much better than what came later.
Do you feel there was less developer pressure?
No,
because I assume money has always talked loudest, but
no, not at
just
all.
A sense
I think the architects who succeeded had to be very good at dealing with that, and there's this. Raymond Hood was the architect of RCA building, and it was in an earlier building. He wanted the building to be, I'm sorry. It was with the RCA building, because he wanted the RCA building to be limestone, and the developer was trying to argue that he really had to be brick because it had to be cheaper, and Hood said, "Well, I think you're right. I think." We could do it in galvanized metal. That would be even cheaper. And he sort of went on from there, and then the developer suddenly realized, maybe we should go with limestone.
I'm going to be remembered for this building. Yeah.
But the architects were definitely under those pressures. They certainly didn't have a free hand, and
they were just more successful.
They were skillful partly at dealing with it, because Hood did some beautiful brick high-rise buildings, which were sort of lower budget buildings where they couldn't afford stone and they had to go with brick. And he just figured out how to make them interesting, even though they were a sort of cheaper material.
But now it's all green glass.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was my first experience in Toronto. 2002 was the first time I took a business trip up there, and that was just around the time that the aliens were coming in with their cranes and putting up these. And I've gone back almost every year for almost 20 years, and it's down by the water. It's just this repeating line of green glass towers for everybody.
And it's also, apart from the ecological thing that it's hard to justify an energy conserving building which is all glass. It's not even pleasant from the inside, because this was an old industrial building, so we have this. Imagine if this sill wasn't there. It would not be better. It would be worse. It would be like you'd feel like you're going to fall out the window.
That's the big selling point, that floor-to-ceiling glass.
Yeah, but it is. Yeah. But I think it was really a mistake.
Yeah.
And including the RCA building, all those buildings, for one thing, they didn't have air conditioning. So they all had to have double-hung, openable windows. Otherwise, you'd die in there. So all the early high-rise buildings actually have, 3-foot wide double-hung windows, and the architect has to figure out how to use, put little windows in a building that's 40 stories high and not make it look stupid. And they did figure it out. They put them in rows, but they're all like 50% glass, and there's even a quote I came across recently from, I think it was Cray, the Philadelphia architect, who said, he was talking about the German modernism and saying, it doesn't make sense to make all glass buildings. I mean, you can't justify it in our climate. And they didn't until recently, where I'm convinced it's all driven by economics. It's just cheaper.
Yeah. That's what I wondered, how much, money kind of drives all this stuff. Unfortunately, the one time I've stayed in a Trump building, in 2014, I was flown to Scotland on a PR junket for my old job, and it was in one of his golf resorts that old building. This was June, and apparently Scotland had never had 4 straight days over 70 degrees Fahrenheit historically before I got there. This thing, beautiful windows all facing out towards the sea, all of which were magnifying all the sunlight coming into my room. So they were literally set up 8 fans for me, trying to cool the place down. But it was over 90 degrees inside my room because they hadn't refurbished for air conditioning. And this is how the changing climate managed to affect buildings that once upon a time were perfectly suitable to the environment. So Turnberry, that was the course, but I didn't pay for anything, so I don't feel like I violated the emoluments clause or anything like that. But yeah, it was a very strange experience. I'm like, is it always like this? Like, it has never been like this in the history of Scotland, but we're just getting all of this sun right in your room right now. So yeah, things are a little odd. In a flip of the question of what building you'd get rid of, building you lament the loss of, something you actually, a building you've actually been to or seen that's been lost since.
Oh.
Because everybody will just go for Penn Station in New York, but, something from your...
I don't know. I'd have to really think hard. No, I can't think of it offhand. It would probably be more likely in Montreal than here, because I would be a building that I'd seen as a student or as a young person, and then no, I can't think of it.
And rebuilding Notre Dame? I think you mentioned you did a short column on it, but
I did I also did a longer one.
Oh yeah.
I was trying to argue that we have this warped idea that somehow trying to rebuild something seamlessly is somehow inauthentic.
Which comes up in Charleston Fancy.
It does come up.
That was a fascinating part of it too. Yeah.
And I was arguing that traditionally that's actually what people did, and that if you had a sort of beloved building that for some reason fell down or got blown up or burnt down, the human response is just to replace it as if it had never happened. And that's what people did. I mean, the example I gave was like the bell tower of St. Mark's Square fell down in early 1900s. Just there are pictures. It's just a pile of rubble. In one day, they decided they would rebuild it, and they just rebuilt it. And it looks exactly the same. I mean, they didn't build a new one. They just built the old one. They added an elevator. And they added structural reinforcement to make sure it didn't happen again. But that's actually a human reaction, is to say something terrible has happened, and I want to put it back so that it'll be as good as before. Mm-hmm. And somehow we've gotten convinced that that's the wrong thing to do, that you can't put back what was there before, that you have to, particularly if it's an old building, and if you've lost it, you have to make a difference between what you did and what was there before, and that if it's that for some reason, if people don't know what was old and what was new, that's a bad thing.
Yeah, that was what I found puzzling. That sense from that agreement among architects of, you don't, even if you're making an addition, you make it so that people wouldn't be confused that this was not part of the original.
I think it all comes from art historians.
Yeah.
I would really blame them, because sometime in the early 20th century, where this all got sort of formalized, it tended to be formalized by art historians, and they looked at buildings the way they look at paintings or sculpture, and they said, well, if a piece of a famous sculpture breaks, you just have to live with it. You can't, and if you do replace it, you have to be very clear about what is new and what is old, because it's the hand of the artist is not longer present. But of course, a building isn't like that anyway, and buildings change immediately as they're finished, or even before they're finished. And buildings are not works of art in the same way that paintings are. I mean, they're not the product of one person. They're usually a product of teams of people, and the builder is there, the architect is there, the engineer is there, and especially old buildings go through all sorts of additions and changes, and some of which are just technology. I mean, you get a better heating system, you put it in. You try to not disturb the building, but you don't say that wasn't there originally. So the art historians somehow have convinced us that an old building can't be changed, that something is lost, and that if you make a change, and this is now part of law in many countries, you have to be very clear about what's new and what's old, which of course was never the case. And also when you repoint brick, you don't distinguish the fact that you repointed it. You just repoint it. Or when you repaint wood, wood rots, so you replace it. Most buildings have, especially as they get older, there are many, many changes that happen, and it's just part of the life of a building. And then there are functional changes, because you want to keep the building, but the function has changed, and so you need to make alterations, big or small. And again, it's simply part of the building, part of the life of the building. And somehow treating buildings as if you can't touch them is very, very artificial. And as I tried to point out, it's not historical. It's actually a new idea. Mostly in the past, if you look at Moorish buildings, for instance, they're built out of large sections of Roman buildings. Like, they would just recycle columns, because the columns are beautiful, and they didn't care about the Roman buildings, so they would just take the columns and use them. And there are mosques that are just completely built where the columns and capitals are all Roman. And then when they run out, or where they don't fit, then they make new ones. Sometimes the new ones are copies of the old ones. Sometimes they don't look like the old ones. The Byzantine architecture is like that. There was a lot of recycling of old bits. Again, that would be considered awful today, that you would take from one building and put it in another and mix it all up, and as if a building was somehow such a clear statement, and
that it's a fixed in time. Yeah, like you said, about treating it as though it's a piece of art.
And I think the other problem is that the modern architecture starts with the notion that every age requires its own architecture. That's the rationale.
Yeah.
And, you can agree or disagree, but that was the rationale that was used. If you accept that rationale, then when you can't just change, you can't just add on to architecture the way it was, because you're a different age. So if the spire of Notre Dame is burnt down, if you're adding a new spire, it has to be different, because your age is not the Middle Ages or whenever it was built. So it's connected with, I think, modern architecture in a way that wasn't the case before modern architecture. Before modern architecture, architects didn't have this idea that every age needs its own architecture, because they were continually copying from previous ages and recycling ideas, and so they didn't have this point of view, and so I think that's part of the explanation too.
We'll see what they end up building. Did you read the harrowing article about how close they came to the entire shebang collapsing? Yeah, that was literally on the edge of my seat while reading it, just seeing all the moment by moment things that could have led to the bell towers coming down and destroying the rest of the site.
The other thing is, which we're now learning more about, is these tons and tons of lead that was melted off the roof and goes into the environment, and they're only starting to discover the side effects of that.
Yeah.
And again, nobody's suggesting, I think, you would put back a lead roof.
No.
And I mentioned in this article about, for instance, I suspect a steel roof would make a lot more sense. A fireproof steel roof that's lighter. I mean, nobody sees it.
Yeah.
And,
makes sense.
Why would you make another wooden roof that eventually is going to have the same problems? I mean,
at best, of course, you could find some other, wood-related problems.
Although I suspect that story we're not seeing the end of, because from my reading, Gothic vaults are simply self-supporting; they don't carry weight. Mm-hmm. But the effect of the fire and water on the vault is devastating potentially. So how strong the surviving vault is, I think, is far from clear. And I mean, I hope this is not the case, but it's quite possible that there was really major damage done, because those vaults were never intended to resist water, and they have this medieval mortar that never was wet. I mean, it was always protected. And then suddenly there's like a lot of water was shot up there, and God knows what effect that is. So I know that they're monitoring the whole thing now and trying to see whether there's any movement, because I think it's far from clear what the effects of this fire and water are on the existing structure.
Well, we started the conversation with a set of ruins, and we come back around to it ultimately. But I have to get back to New Jersey. But I did want to ask one question about moving from the suburbs out here before I leave. Did you have to cull the books? How much of your library did you take along with you, and what was any sort of culling principle that went into it?
I can't remember the numbers now, but it must have been at least 3/4 was culled. I went through the architecture books, and basically I went through all the books, and sort of books that I figured I would want to read again, I kept, and the books that I liked but I'd only read once and I had really no intention of reading again were the ones I got rid of. With architecture, it was sort of similar, although, on the one hand, I could have said, well, I should keep everything because I might refer to it. On the other hand, with the university nearby, I just go to the library and look things up. Yeah. I know where they are. So, moving is so traumatic. I think when
now I've lived in the same house for 48 years. Yeah. That's the point. I can't possibly decide what to take. Go on. Sorry.
But going through the books was just simply one small thing in a whole bunch of things.
Oh, I'm sure.
Because we downsized, furniture and clothing and all sorts of things. So the books, in a way, was just it was easily done because it was just part of that hectic period. And the architecture books I sold to a used book place that was interested, a lot of the books I just gave away to Salvation Army. Encyclopedias nobody wants at all.
Yeah.
You can't even give them away. They're just not interested in it. And I must say I hadn't looked into my encyclopedia for years. Whereas we used to consult it, all the time before Wikipedia and so on. You would be sitting around, and if you wanted to know something, you would go to the encyclopedia. It was just and so it was used a lot. Yeah. But then at one point it just stopped. So I didn't keep necessarily. I kept books like. I kept Elmer Leonard and
your Bernie Gunther novels by Philip Carr.
The Bernie Gunther novels I kept, because I do reread them. Yeah. Or what's his name, the Patrick O'Neill, the sea stories. Yeah. Every few years I read through them. Yeah. So it's funny when you look at what books you really reread. It's often not sort of the great books, at least not in my case. Although there were a few, like I kept Jane Austen. I don't know if I'll read her again or not.
But the security of yes. having her on the shelf is good. So,
yeah.
Cool. Witold, thanks so much for coming back on the show. I really appreciate getting to catch up again.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And that was Witold Rybczynski. His new book is Charleston Fancy, Little Houses and Big Dreams in the Holy City, from Yale University Press. And it really is a joy to read. I hope we got across some of what makes Charleston unique and what the appeal is behind both these homes that his coterie of people were building, and what makes them so interesting as people. So, Charleston Fancy, give it a read. Witold's website is witoldrybczynski.com. Which is spelled just like it sounds. I kid. It goes something like this: WITOLDRYBCZYNSKI.com. You've got a spelling of his name from this episode, so just plug that into your search engine. You'll find it. You can find loads of information on the website there about Witold's columns, essays, books, press, book tour, speaking dates. In fact, he's got one coming up in Charleston in the middle of October that should be pretty amazing. He's also on Twitter as Witold R, WITOLDR. So his first name, last initial. Now, after we wrapped, I asked Witold, so, who you been reading? And if you want to hear his answer to that and get some extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. I'll get rolling with the third quarter 2019 episode soon. The second quarter episode features an hour of book recommendations and fun conversation with Mark Allen Stamety, David Shields, Michael Carroll, Frederick Tutton, Ursi Soteropoulos, Caitlin Foisey, Seth, Nina Bunjevac, Stephen Guarnacha, Hugh Ryan, Bill Griffith, Boris Fishman, and Barbara Nessim. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. And I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, secret project that I swear to God I'm going to finish before the end of this year, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this episode during some business in Philadelphia, so no travel costs. I had some lunch and coffee before our session, but his place is a short walk to the train station, so no cab fare or anything for travel expenses. Still, if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, and coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Buzz Carter, Michael Hacker, Fred Kish, Annie Koyama, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Lescamella, Stephen Nadler, Barbara Nessim, Jim Ottaviani, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, Armando Veve, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.